Good day and welcome back. Tonight I'm going to take a look at Frank Herbert's Dune. This novel won the Hugo in 1966, a prize that is shared with none other than Roger Zelazny's This Immortal, which we reviewed a couple of weeks back on this channel. Now, for those that have read Dune, you know, the majority will rate this as one of the best science fiction novels of all time. You'd be in a minority if you didn't feel that way about the book, but that's not to say you're right or wrong. It's just to say you would be in a minority. Most of the people just really enjoyed reading this book. Now, I read this book back in 1988 when this particular print was released. It was my first introduction into Dune. And, you know, I've read it several times over the years, and in rereading it for this review, I've been asking myself, you know, what is it about Dune that keeps, not only is it a memorable book, but it keeps almost begging you to reread it. And I was sort of, as I was reading it through for the review, I really started to ask my question, what is it exactly about Dune that just makes you want to continue reading it and rereading it? And I started asking myself, you know, is it the plot? You know, we're talking about an intergalactic empire, almost Game of Thrones, politicking happening in it. Then I also started thinking about the characters. You know, is it the complex characters, both male and female, strong leads that are in this book? Pardon me. Or is it the world building? You know, the way that Frank Herbert uses all these different means to build this, what is a very realistic and believable world, or is a combination of all those things. So for those of you who are not familiar with Dune, which I suspect is a minority given that this is a science fiction channel that sort of attracts the few followers we have, which are hardcore science fiction readers. So I believe I'll be speaking to the minority. But, you know, the book pretty much follows the monomyth or the hero's journey. It's got those 3 discrete chapters in the separation, invitation and return, and it follows it quite closely. And I think that's part of the appeal for the book. I think that the hero's journey or the monomyth, the structure of that narrative just talks to the human spirit, I think. And there are a few stories that utilize, and when used properly, I think there are very few stories that just don't attract you or don't have that sense of appeal that these sort of stories talk to, right? I think it's just one of the things about that monomyth that if it's done properly, which I believe Dune is, there's something about the human spirit that just gets attracted to that. So for those of you who are not familiar with the storyline for Dune, which I suspect I'm speaking to the minority here, the story, like I said, follows the hero's journey, and it's really the story about Paul Atreides, who's the son and the heir of House Atreides, and the Duke being Leto Atreides. And they live on this oceanic planet called Caladan, and they're the head of this very, you know, rich and influential and powerful family. And Paul is the heir to the throne, and he's also the son of a Bene Gesserit witch and a lady called Jessica, who's Leto's concubine. So he's not his wife, but her concubine. And the reason that is because the book deals a lot with intergalactic politics and empires. It's almost like that Game of Thrones, sort of very heavily politicking between these different houses. And it's not overly done, right? It's nothing like Game of Thrones and the level of sort of politicking that goes in there. But it has got that element of, you know, vast, huge galactic empires and these powerful homes and houses at war. And not so much at war with each other because the sort of galactic empire controls what really happens there. But they're always trying to get the edge over each other. So there's a great element of that. So Paul Atreides is the son of Leto and Jessica, the Bene Gesserit witch. And she conceived Paul out of the order of the Bene Gesserit wishes. And the reason that is that because the Bene Gesserits have been developing this breeding program where they want to, give birth to this Bene Gesserit witch woman who would lead him to the next chapter. But because of the love that Jessica had for Leto, she's betrayed the duty and the wish of the Bene Gesserits and honoured Leto's desire to have a son. So what we find is that following that hero's journey narrative, what we find is that Paul goes through this test by one of the Bene Gesserit's holy mothers, and he passes that test. And Jessica's been sort of raising Paul to be a Bene Gesserit in many ways. So she's already started the training for what could potentially be this great Bene Gesserit male witch or warlock. So what happens is that the emperor, a guy called, what was his name? Shadakar? I believe it's Shadakar. I always sort of gloss over the name. But he's sort of getting a bit concerned with the growing power of Leto. And he sets Leto out to take over a planet called Arrakis. Now, Arrakis is a very dry, almost inhabitable world, but it's also a very important world in the Empire, in the Galactic Empire that Frank Herbert's written here, because it's the only place in the galaxy that you can actually get spice or melange. And spice is basically prevalent in all the foods, but it has also some very addictive qualities to it. And it's also used by the guild, the astronomical guild, I think they're called, but it's also used by the guild to aid them to safely traverse intergalactic distances at galactic and faster than light speeds. So it's a very sought after substance, and one that makes the ruling family of Arrakis very wealthy. But the emperor has done this on purpose, because the existing monarch or governing body of these families, these sort of conflicting families, is none other than the villain in the book, the antagonist, the Baron Harkonnen. And he's almost the typical villain. If you wanted to create the most vile creature on earth, and what qualities would that person have, you'd be very close to coming up with Baron Harkonnen in this novel. So he's currently the leader of this planet, what's it called? Arrakis. And he's been, pushed aside, and Lord Harkonnen and the Emperor are in on this, but they've pushed, he set himself back, put Leto in charge, in a very political means of getting rid of Leto. And they do just that. Leto is assassinated, and Paul then begins his journey through both manhood, through his ultimate destiny. He meets up with these fellow, he's basically evicted out of his household, and him and his mother go through this journey where they meet the Fremen, which are local inhabitants of Arrakis. And the story then goes on to basically following the hero's journey, the monomyth, in all separate stages of it, to ultimately, the ending of the book and the cataclysm of it. Look, it's a very interesting book. So that's a quick overview of the plot. I suspect that most of you are familiar with this. I didn't want to dwell too much on the plot, apart from saying that it follows pretty closely the monomyth or the hero's journey. And I think that's part of the reason why Frank Herbert's Dune works so well. I think that the monomyth, that structure, just speaks to the human spirit somehow. And I think there's a core that we all sort of largely respond to. The other one is the world building in Frank Herbert's Dune. And I got thinking about it too. What is it about Arrakis that makes it so believable? And I think a lot of that is the way that Frank Herbert brings so much of what almost looks like facts into the narrative of the novel. So at the beginning of every chapter, or every major heading in the book, it begins with an extract by Princess Ilanin? I can never pronounce the name, who tells an account of the stories of Paul Atreides, or Muad'Dib, as he's known, or he's become to be known by the local Fremen. And there's all these little extracts and little tales of the Butlerian Jihad, for example. So he's almost building this history and he uses little extracts of that history. So he uses extracts from the OC Bible, which further enhance the sense of, hey, this is a real world. This is their religion. These are their artifacts. This is the accounts of these historical figures. And we're telling the story about that account. So I think that plays a large part in making the world of Arrakis very believable. I think the other thing that really helps with making the world building here so believable is that most of us can relate to a desert world. I think we've all seen deserts on television. So we get that, we can put that image of in our head of what does a barren desert landscape look like, and what would be the challenges in living in a landscape like that, that makes Arrakis believable. So yeah, the world building I think is wonderful. I think, and I really do enjoy the way that Frank Herbert builds religion into his novel. He's done that in the Jesus incident that I've got here just beside me, and the rest of the sequels like Dune Messiah and God Emperor Dune. He always plays on this concept of religion and how religion shapes societies, individuals, and can almost be used to control people in many ways as well. So there's an element of that definitely in Frank Herbert's Dune, and something that I always like, sort of religious books, and I find that interesting in Frank Herbert's Dune, how he basically builds this messiah figure in Paul Atreides, and the way that he uses religion to show how culturally the Fremen exist, and I think it's just wonderfully done. The other thing that I really enjoy a lot about Frank Herbert's Dune, it is a science fiction novel, and no one will argue that, but it doesn't play on the science fiction elements at all, really. I think it's more, in some ways, a fantasy / science fiction novel. But what Frank Herbert does really well, there's definitely elements of science fiction in here, don't get me wrong. We're talking about futuristic worlds. We're talking about galactic empires. We're talking about technologies that use faster than light speeds, using spice or melange to allow these navigators to control these spaces safely. But he doesn't play up on the technologies of it, and he does that on purpose, I believe, because what he's really done here is concentrated on what will humanity look like in the future, in a world where we have these galactic empires, and how will religion still play a part in people's mentality and influence of different countries, different nations, different planets, right? So he's really focused on the science fiction element of humanity more than he's done in the particular, scientific or technological changes in the novel. So it doesn't really talk to the spaceships and how they work. It really doesn't talk to too much about the technology in the book. However, having said that, I love the Fremen still suits. And for those of you who don't know this book and the novel, but basically because Arrakis is such a dry and barren landscape, moisture is basically currency. So, every single part of your body's moisture needs to be retained to maintain life on this planet. And they have these special suits, which he does go into a fair bit of detail around how the suit operates, how it basically, recirculates your perspiration, your breathing to collect the moisture and very effectively reuse your body moisture, so you don't use any of your actual body moisture to the elements, but it gets refiltered through your bodysuit, through your still suit, and allows you to live long, to survive for long times in these barren landscapes. So he does go to the science and technology of that a little bit, which I thought was cool. Yeah, but the main focus is on humanity. What will humanity look like, and what are these galactic empires, and how will they interact? And I think it's just wonderfully done. The other thing that I think Frank Herbert really pioneered is the whole terraforming sort of novel scene. Every time I read Dune, and I've read it several times, but every time I read Dune and I read about the ecology science, the science of ecology in the book, and about preservation of the environment and terraforming the environment and the landscape that and taking care of the landscape and treasuring the landscape, as barren or as unforgiving and unformidable as Arrakis is, but the passion and the love and the care that the Fremen have have for the planet, I think speaks a lot to humanity, right? And so the science of ecology is pretty strong in the book, and preservation. So the science of ecology is pretty strong through the book, and I can't help but think that books like Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars and the terraforming. I wonder how much books like Frank Herbert Dune inspired that generation of writers, which I think Red Mars is just one of the top of those type of books. So Frank Herbert's Dune. What is it about Dune that makes it one of the greatest novels of all time? I think for me, it is all of those things. I think the hero's journey does pull at the human heartstrings. I think the complexity of characters, you have the most villainous of villains. You have, I think, what Frank Herbert set out to do, which was write the hero of heroes. You have these strong female characters, strong male characters that are complex and complicated and offer a lot to the reader. You have this wonderful world building, great science fiction elements about a future world, about ecology and the preservation of our planet. You have these awesome alien creatures in the worms. I didn't talk about the worms. How can you talk about Arrakis and not the worms? So for those of you, again, the minority who haven't read Dune, worms are probably the most prolific life form on the planet. There's other little things like the Muad'Dib, which is this tiny little mouse that hops around in the desert. But the what are they called, the worms? They're called the Maker, the Worm, and there's another name that is given to these creatures, which I can't recall. But there's basically these huge, massive worm things that travel through the sand, and they get attracted to man-made noises, and they basically can swallow whole starships whole. So they're massive creatures that have got a very tight relationship with the menage or spice. So you can't talk about Arrakis without talking about the worms, which I almost just did. So look, Frank Herbert's Dune. Who would I recommend it to? Man, it's really difficult not to recommend this to anyone, right? Frank Herbert Dune is one of the pinnacle of science fiction. It's a wonderful book, but to give specific recommendations, I would recommend Frank Herbert's Dune to people who do like fantasy. I think it's a great bridging novel. If you're a really strong fantasy reader and you've never read science fiction and you're wondering what the whole genre is about, you'll be far-fetched from finding a better book than Dune to start your science fiction journey on. And I'll give that same recommendation to any new science fiction reader. You'll be hard-pressed to find a better book than Dune to get you started in a science fiction love affair, right? Who else would I recommend Frank Herbert's Dune to? Anyone who likes science fiction. If you haven't read this book, you owe it to yourself to read it. Because there are really three types of people in the world, I believe. Those who love Frank Herbert Dune, the minority who have read it and don't like it, and those who haven't. And I think you'll be doing yourself a disjustice if you don't put yourself into at least one of those two categories. A, you love it, or B, you've read it but you don't care for the novel. So don't leave yourself in that lukewarm position where you've never read this novel. Frank Herbert's Dune, we have to rank it. We're going to have to rank it. So let's go to the Sci-Fi Shed and see where we're going to put this one tonight. So back to the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder. For those of you who've been watching for a while, you may have noticed I've moved things a little just to accommodate the boom stand here and the microphone. But I'm hoping we can still see the screen okay, if not better. So where we are today is looking at Frank Herbert's Dune. And it's probably not going to be a very difficult decision, this one. But where shall we begin? I think let's start with the book that shared the 1966 Hugo Award. in This Immortal by Roger Zelazny. Now, when I reviewed Roger Zelazny's book, I did say that it's unfair to rank the two books because they're two very different books and they're two very great books. And one shouldn't be judged against the other for the pure enjoyment of it. They're very different books and both very worthy Hugo and Nebula award-winning books. So I don't think it's fair to say one is better than the other in the sense of the Hugo ratings. But this is the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder, and that's what we're doing, is we're ranking all these books against each other. So we've really got no choice, and we've got to make a decision. Is Frank Herbert's Dune better than This Immortal by Roger Zelazny? And I think it is. It's because of all the things I've really talked about. I think the characters are great. There's really nothing I can fault with Dune, and it's going to be like that for pretty much most of these books. So let's just go through the list. I've talked to all the reasons why I think this is a great book. So yes, I think it's better than This Immortal. I think it is better than The Left Hand of Darkness. I think it is better than The Forever War. Are we going to have surprises? I think it is better than To Your Scattered Bodies Go. And as much as I like Way Station by Clifford Simak, Dune, I'll be hard pressed to recommend any of these books on the list so far above Frank Herbert's Dune. It is a wonderful novel. I was trying to find things that I can say I don't like about it, but I can't. And it's one of the few books that I'm not only read and reread, but I read at least every couple of years. And I follow that up with some of the sequels as well. Which I've done, mind you, with a lot of these books that are on the list as well. For example, To Your Scattered Bodies Go by Philip Jose Farmer, The Fabulous Riverboat, The Gods of the Riverworld, etc. All the sequels I've read. Same with The Forever War and The Forever Peace. The Left Hand of Darkness, Ursula Le Guin. Although these books are all standalone novels, they are in the same universe, and I've read most of them, if not all of the books in that universe. What else is the rest of them are standalone novels. So, but this is one of those that I continue going back to, reread and follow up with reading the sequels as well. Is it going to remain at the top? I think you're going to be surprised. There are a lot of books on the Hugo and Nebula award-winning ladder. This is where we are today. I do think there are a couple of books on that list that will challenge Frank Herbert's Dune. But I guess you're going to have to hit the like, subscribe, and notification bell to find out if and when those books come up. But as it is today, I think we've got 10 now. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Yep, the top 10 so far. And Frank Herbert's Dune does top the list at the moment. Hey, maybe the next couple of videos we may do a roundup and just go through some of these novels again to refresh our memories, and we might need to do that over the next couple of weeks just to make sure that these novels and what we liked and didn't like about them are clear and the forefront of our mind. That way when we go through the next 90, 100 odd books that we've got in the Hugo and Nebula, we may start to compare these and contrast them and help make what will be even more difficult decisions. But that's where we are. The top 10 so far, it's the only 10, but I'm still going to count it as the top 10 science fiction novels of all time. Well, this has been Peter. This has been The Shed, and I thank you for your time, and I'll see you next time in The Shed.